Shoppers froze, security closed in, and in seconds her dignity was on trial, not the truth. But just as they prepared to drag her out, a hidden camera caught everything, and what it revealed would shatter the room. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The chandeliers glittered above the ballroom, like frozen constellations, spilling their golden light across silk gowns and polished tuxedos. The air was thick with the scent of champagne and the hum of quiet laughter, the kind of atmosphere that whispered exclusivity. This was the Hayes Foundation Gala, an event whispered about in financial magazines and coveted by every aspiring socialite in Manhattan. Beneath the music and clinking glasses, the unspoken message rang clear. Only the powerful belonged here. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the edge of the dance floor, the weight of that message pressing against her chest. She wore a gown of deep sapphire that hugged her tall frame with quiet elegance, her dark skin gleaming beneath the lights. On her arm was Richard Whitmore, her husband hedge fund magnate, darling of Wall Street, and tonight's keynote guest. To the room, Richard belonged effortlessly. His laugh carried, his handshakes lingered, his name unlocked doors. But when eyes drifted to Eleanor, they did not soften in admiration. They lingered, measured, judged. She felt it as she had countless times before. An undercurrent, sharp and cutting, telling her that even in the dress, even at her husband's side, she was an intruder. The orchestra shifted into a brighter tune, couples spinning in carefully practiced waltzes. Eleanor watched them, smiling faintly. But the smile did not reach her eyes. Richard was deep in conversation with two board members, his tone smooth and his body angled away from her. Eleanor held her champagne glass a little tighter, pretending not to notice the subtle exclusion. She told herself she had grown used to it. The polite nods, the perfunctory compliments, the small circles that tightened as soon as she approached. Then Victoria Hayes arrived. She cut through the room like a blade, tall, blonde, and impossibly composed in a gown that shimmered like liquid silver. As the daughter of the Foundation's founder and self-proclaimed guardian of old New York society, Victoria's word carried weight in these circles. Her smile was a performance, her gestures calculated, her disdain sharpened and ready for anyone who dared not meet her unspoken standard. From the moment Richard had married Eleanor, Victoria had made her position known. She was polite in public, but her compliments always came with barbs. Her invitations carefully omitted Eleanor's name, her whispers strategically placed where they would sting most. Tonight, however, Victoria was not content with whispers. She approached Eleanor with the kind of grace that deceived, her heels clicking in time with the orchestra. A hush seemed to ripple through the nearest guests. Eleanor braced herself, sensing the storm before it arrived. Victoria stopped just inches away, her painted smile fixed but her eyes cold. It was a statement that seemed flattering on the surface but landed like a stone in Eleanor's chest. She could hear the subtext, "You don't belong, but look at you trying." Eleanor met Victoria's gaze with quiet steadiness. She refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But then, without warning, the mask slipped. In one swift, shocking motion, Victoria's hand arced through the air and landed against Eleanor's cheek with a sharp crack. The sound cut through the music like a gunshot. Gasps rippled across the ballroom, and the orchestra faltered, strings squealing in disarray. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to shiver with the collective intake of breath. Around her the room froze. Men in tuxedos stiffened, women in jewels raised their hands to their mouths. But no one stepped forward. Not a single voice rose in protest. The silence was louder than the slap itself, ringing in Eleanor's ears, pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. And in that silence lived the truth. The complicity, the hierarchy, the unspoken rule that Eleanor was not to be defended. She was black in a room built for white wealth, tolerated only through the man she had married. And when the line was crossed, when her dignity was stripped with a single strike, not one of them believed it was their place to stand for her. Victoria's face did not flinch. She adjusted the strap of her gown, as though nothing had happened, her chin lifting with aristocratic certainty. Richard had not even seen it. He was still deep in conversation a few steps away, his back turned, his laughter floating across the room in cruel contrast to the silence that held Eleanor captive. She felt both abandoned and exposed, her husband oblivious, her peers complicit. The sting on her cheek deepened, not from pain but from the weight of invisibility. Eleanor willed her spine to remain straight, her chin lifted. If she faltered, If she let them see her break, then Victoria would have taken more than her pride. She would have taken her place in this world entirely. The seconds stretched, unbearably long, until a sound shattered the stillness. Click. A camera flash burst from the edge of the room, quick and blinding. Someone had captured it. The slap, the silence, the shame that hung in the golden air of the ballroom. Eleanor's breath caught. For the first time since Victoria's hand had struck her, a flicker of possibility stirred. Someone had seen. Someone had. But as the camera lowered, Eleanor realized with a jolt, she had no idea whose hands now held her humiliation. No one rushed to defend Eleanor, except a single camera flash caught the moment, freezing her fate in someone else's possession. The sting of Victoria's hand still burned on Eleanor's cheek as she retreated to the edge of the ballroom, the camera flash replaying in her mind like lightning caught in a loop. She forced her breathing into rhythm, chin high, eyes steady, pretending that nothing had cracked. But inside something had splintered. That single slap had not been just an act of cruelty, it was a culmination, a public unveiling of everything she had been enduring in silence. She had always known this world was not built for her. Even before marrying Richard, she had sensed the distance between where she came from and where she now stood. But tonight, beneath the crystal chandeliers and gilded ceilings, the difference had never been clearer. She could have walked out of the ballroom right then, but her feet would not move. She was too aware of the stares that followed her every motion, waiting to see if she would falter. The truth was, Eleanor had been faltering for years. When she met Richard, it was not at some glittering charity event, but in the cramped study hall of her graduate program. He was already successful, the son of a banking family with an MBA polished onto his resume. Their courtship was quick and tense, and to her sincere. But the moment he put a ring on her finger, everything changed. She discovered quickly that marrying into his world came with rules no one bothered to say out loud, but everyone enforced. The whispers began at the engagement party. One woman, smiling too wide, had leaned in and said, "You're so articulate." Richard found himself quite the exception, didn't he? Another guest had simply asked if Eleanor was from the scholarship program at her university, assuming her presence there could only be explained by charity. Eleanor had smiled through it, pretending the sting didn't register. But every remark burrowed deeper. By the time of the wedding, she had perfected the art of invisible endurance. She learned when to laugh politely, when to nod, when to step aside so that Richard could shine without her presence dragging the air down. What she hadn't learned was how to silence the looks. The stares never softened. They followed her at charity luncheons, board meetings, art auctions, eyes narrowing, measuring, searching for cracks in her composure. To them she was never simply Eleanor. She was always Richard's black wife, a label before a name, a disruption before a person. The wealth around her became a gilded cage. She wore designer gowns but never felt dressed enough. She attended dinners in penthouses but never felt welcomed. She was the whisper in the corner, the topic no one voiced directly, the test case for how far the club of the wealthy was willing to bend without breaking. At night, when Richard was asleep beside her, Eleanor often lay awake staring at the ceiling. The ceiling of their penthouse was high and ornate, but it never gave her comfort. She would think about her mother's tiny apartment, about peeling paint and buzzing heaters, and she would wonder how it was possible to feel more at home in that cramped space than in the endless square footage of her current life. She told herself she endured it for Richard, because he loved her, because he had chosen her despite what others said. But that belief had been cracking for a long time. The gala tonight, the silence that followed Victoria's slap, was only the most visible fracture. Richard, for all his affection in private, had always been careful in public. He never corrected colleagues when they made subtle jokes at her expense. He never challenged the women who excluded her from planning committees or luncheons. When Eleanor brought it up, he would brush it aside with words like, "It's not worth the fight," or "Don't give them power over you." She wanted to believe him, wanted to think his silence was protection, but deep down she knew it was convenient. The irony gnawed at her. She was surrounded by wealth but starved of belonging. She had security but no sanctuary. And tonight, when Victoria's hand struck her, it was as if the world had said out loud what it had whispered all along. "You don't belong here." Her cheeks still burned as she slipped into a quiet corner of the ballroom. From there she watched Richard laughing, with his colleagues, oblivious. The distance between them felt wider than the polished floor separating their feet. She thought of the girl she once was in Atlanta, fierce and determined, and wondered what that girl would think of the woman standing here now. Silent, compliant, enduring. The thought stung more than the slap. But as she stood there, caught in the swirl of memory and humiliation, another memory surfaced. Sharp, unwelcome, and unforgettable. It was the moment, years earlier, when she had first sensed the true cost of her marriage. She had been newly engaged, full of optimism, when Richard invited her to a dinner with his closest business partners. She remembered the mahogany table, the glasses of expensive wine, the way the men spoke to each other in confident tones about deals and futures. She had felt out of place but determined to prove herself. And then one of them, leaning just slightly toward Richard, while thinking she couldn't hear, had said words that branded themselves onto her memory. "She won't fit in with us." The sentence replayed in her mind, now louder than the orchestra, sharper than Victoria's slap. It was the first warning, the first fracture she ignored. Tonight, it returned like a prophecy fulfilled. She remembered the first time Richard's business partners warned him. "She won't fit in with us." The words "she won't fit in with us" echoed like a wound reopening, and Eleanor felt them blending with the sting of Victoria's slap. Victoria Hayes did not retreat after her hand struck. Instead, she lingered, poised as though she had simply adjusted the air around her. That was her power, the audacity to dress cruelty as decorum. Her venom had always worn silk gloves, but tonight, she let the gloves fall. To understand Victoria was to understand the subtle cruelty of her world. She was the heiress who learned early how to command attention without raising her voice, how to exclude without being accused, how to humiliate without a word needing to be repeated. Her public persona was all charm, polished speeches at luncheons, photos with children at charity events, smiles for magazines. But in private, her disdain for Eleanor was relentless. It began the first time Eleanor entered her orbit, months after her engagement to Richard. At a luncheon in Central Park, Eleanor had been seated beside Victoria at a long table filled with women in pastel dresses. Eleanor remembered how the conversation shifted toward heritage and tradition, and how Victoria had smiled before turning to her and asking, "And what's your family background, dear? I imagine it's very different from ours." The women had laughed politely, but the dig landed sharp. Eleanor, unprepared for the casual malice, had simply nodded and answered, "Yes, very different," though the pit in her stomach told her she was meant to feel inferior. From then on, Victoria's barbs multiplied. At galas, she'd comment on Eleanor's gowns, praising them as bold choices. At board dinners, she'd raise her eyebrows when Eleanor spoke about markets, cutting in with lines like, "How refreshing to hear a unique perspective." Richard brushed it off. "That's just Victoria being Victoria," he would say. "Don't let her get under your skin." But Eleanor knew the difference between petty rivalry and systemic disdain. Victoria wasn't mocking her for sport. She was dismantling her piece by piece, carving her out of the spaces she had fought to enter. And now, tonight, Victoria had escalated. Eleanor wondered what pushed her past whispers into public humiliation. Was it the security of the room, the knowledge that no one would intervene? Or was it deeper, a fury that Eleanor had lasted this long despite Victoria's efforts to erase her? Eleanor's cheek throbbed, but her mind raced faster than her pulse. She knew what would happen next. Victoria would smile, laugh, perhaps even twist the story before the night was over. Eleanor would be painted as dramatic, unstable, a woman too sensitive for the rough edges of high society. If she spoke out, she'd be dismissed as overreacting. If she stayed silent, her dignity would rot in silence. A waiter approached timidly with a tray of champagne flutes, eyes darting nervously between the two women. Victoria reached out, took a glass, and said with a voice just loud enough to carry, "Don't look so rattled, Eleanor. These events can be overwhelming for newcomers." The crowd caught the line, some nodding politely, others smirking as though relieved that Victoria had framed the slap as something almost trivial. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but her words refused to rise. What no one saw was the calculation behind Victoria's smirk. For weeks she had been maneuvering behind the scenes, whispering to Richard's investors, sowing seeds of doubt about Eleanor's fit in their world. The slap wasn't spontaneous. It was a strike designed to trigger exactly this reaction, Eleanor's silence. Victoria knew silence would confirm the narrative she had been building, that Eleanor was weak, that she was out of place, that she was undeserving of her seat at the table. But what Victoria didn't anticipate was the camera. Eleanor's eyes darted across the ballroom, Searching for the source of the flash, she caught sight of a young man near the bar, lowering a phone, his expression unreadable. She didn't recognize him, but the realization sent a chill through her. If the footage spread beyond this room, the story might not belong to Victoria anymore. It might not even belong to Eleanor. The orchestra struck up again, softer this time, as if trying to plaster music over the rupture. Richard turned at last, catching Eleanor's stillness, his brow furrowing faintly. He excused himself from his circle of colleagues and started toward her. For a moment, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he had seen, perhaps he would take her side publicly, force Victoria to face consequences. She straightened, steadying herself for his arrival. But as Richard drew near, Victoria leaned close to him first, her voice dripping with practiced concern. "Richard, darling, Eleanor seems a little shaken. Perhaps these events are too much pressure for her." The words landed like daggers, cast not as insult, but as care. Guests nearby leaned in, the narrative shifting before Eleanor could speak. She watched her husband's face tighten, not in anger at Victoria, but in uncertainty, caught between perception and truth. Eleanor's throat burned. It was happening again. The same dismissal she had endured for years, now weaponized against her in front of everyone. Victoria wasn't simply cruel. She was strategic, weaving humiliation into a performance no one dared to question. And then, just as Richard opened his mouth, an unexpected twist arrived. A voice rang out from across the room. Sharp, clear, cutting through the chatter. "I saw it. Don't pretend she imagined it." Heads turned. It was the young man with the phone, his expression steady now, his words refusing to let the moment dissolve. The ballroom froze again, but this time for a different reason. Eleanor's chest tightened. Someone finally had spoken, but the relief was short-lived. Because when Eleanor looked closer, recognition jolted through her. She knew him. He wasn't a stranger. He was the son of one of Richard's board members, an intern in Richard's own firm, someone who should never have been in this ballroom, and someone with everything to lose by speaking out.
Why would he risk everything for her?
Eleanor's breath caught as Richard turned sharply, his gaze snapping between the young man, Victoria, and his wife. The tension thickened, questions unspoken, allegiances uncertain. Eleanor stood frozen, the weight of choice looming, not hers this time, but Richard. Eleanor stood frozen, waiting, because Richard's reaction now would determine everything. The air in the ballroom was electric, charged with tension that no chandelier light or polished string quartet could disguise. Every gaze shifted to Richard Whitmore. He stood a step away from his wife, his jaw tight, his mind already racing, not toward Eleanor's pain, but toward calculation. The young man with the phone had spoken. "I saw it. Don't pretend she imagined it." His voice still echoed against the marble walls. A ripple of unease spread through the guests, some pretending to sip champagne, others clutching their pearls a little tighter. Victoria, unflappable as ever, tilted her head in faint annoyance. All eyes fell back on Richard. Eleanor searched her husband's face for something: outrage, protection, the simple human instinct to stand beside her. But what she saw instead was hesitation. It was fleeting, subtle, but devastating. He glanced at Victoria, then at the investors standing nearby, their expressions caught between curiosity and caution. Every one of them was waiting to see how he would define the story. "Richard," Eleanor said softly, the first word she had spoken since the slap. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "You saw what happened." He swallowed. The silence around him grew heavier, as if the whole ballroom had stopped breathing. Finally, he forced a smile, one that didn't reach his eye. "Perhaps we should not make a scene," he murmured, words meant for Eleanor but audible enough for the crowd. The knife slid clean into her chest. She felt the sting sharper than Victoria's slap. Victoria's lips curved in triumph. "Richard's right," she said smoothly, her tone dripping with condescension. "These events can be overwhelming. Emotions run high. Best to let it rest." Eleanor's throat constricted, but she couldn't move. The crowd's response was silence again. Complicit, cowardly. The young man with the phone clenched his jaw, his shoulders tense as if he wanted to protest. But even he seemed to feel the weight of Richard's refusal to act. Inside, Richard's mind was a storm. He knew what the right thing was. He had seen the cruelty, the slap, the venom dripping from Victoria's every word. But he also saw the ripple effect, the foundation's donors, his board members, the delicate balance of deals and alliances he had spent years constructing. Standing against Victoria meant more than defending his wife. It meant alienating the Hayes family, the old money elite who still held sway in the city's financial arteries. And so he hesitated. A board member edged closer, whispering under his breath, "Keep it contained, Richard. Don't escalate. It's better this way." Another leaned in from the other side, murmuring, "Investors are watching. Don't let sentiment cloud the optics." Their words pressed against him like a vice. He looked at Eleanor again, her cheek still flushed from the slap, her eyes glistening not with tears, but with betrayal. For the first time in years, Richard couldn't meet her gaze. Eleanor felt the distance widening. She thought of the girl she used to be in Atlanta, the girl who had promised herself she'd never let anyone reduce her. And yet here she was, diminished not by strangers, but by the silence of the man who vowed to love her. Victoria, sensing victory, leaned slightly toward Richard, her voice velvet, but venomous. "You know as well as I do, Richard. Appearances matter." Eleanor wanted to scream, but the room allowed no such honesty. Every gesture, every glance was scrutinized. She stood frozen, dignity slipping through her fingers. If Richard would not defend her, then what did she have left? The young man still clutched his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. His eyes met Eleanor's briefly, a silent question passing between them. "Do you want the world to see?" Eleanor couldn't answer aloud. Her lips barely moved, but he seemed to understand. He slipped quietly back into the crowd, the glow of his phone disappearing as he tapped at the screen. Victoria turned back to Eleanor, her tone light as silk. "Darling, no hard feelings. You'll find that these things pass quickly when one learns not to overreact." The cruelty of the line sank into Eleanor like ice water. Overreact. That was what they would call it. Not humiliation. Not racism. Just an overreaction. Richard cleared his throat, his voice a low murmur, meant to end the matter. "Let's move on. There's still a program to finish." Eleanor wanted to laugh at the absurdity. A program. As if her dignity were a minor disruption in an evening agenda. She stood straighter, every muscle taut, refusing to let her body betray the collapse she felt inside. If Richard would not stand for her, she would stand for herself, silently, stoically, even if it meant shattering inside. The orchestra swelled again, filling the silence with a melody too beautiful for the ugliness it masked. Guests began to murmur, to pretend as though nothing had happened. The room shifted back into its performance of luxury, its dance of wealth, its polite facade. At first it landed in a private group chat of young interns, who worked in finance, none of whom had ever set foot in the Hayes Gala, but all of whom recognized Richard Whitmore's face. They gasped, replayed it, dissected it frame by frame. "That's his wife," one typed. "She got slapped at the gala." Within minutes the clip leaked to Twitter, attached to a single caption, "Money can't buy dignity." The post took flight. By the time the orchestra swelled to its second song, thousands had already seen Eleanor's humiliation looped in shaky clarity. Victoria's hand slicing across her face, Eleanor's stunned stillness, Richard's hesitation. By the third song, it had surpassed 100,000 views. The hashtags began forming, jagged and raw. "Slap at the gala." "Protect black women." "Eleanor Whitmore." Others, more venomous, sprouted alongside. "Does she belong there?" "Not our society." "Gold digger exposed." The internet, as always, divided itself into trenches. On one side, defenders rose with fury. They clipped Eleanor's expression after the slap, her refusal to cry, her dignity in silence, and declared her a symbol of composure under racism's hand. "She represents every black woman who's been told to stay quiet when humiliated," one post read. "This is not just about her, it's about us." On the other side, detractors sharpened their claws. They twisted her silence into weakness, her presence into intrusion. Anonymous accounts claimed she had provoked Victoria, though no one could explain how. Others argued she should never have been at the gala to begin with. "Money doesn't erase where you come from," one comment sneered. "She'll never be one of them." Eleanor, once invisible in the corners of galas and boardrooms, was now plastered across millions of screens. Strangers debated her worth, her marriage, her very right to exist in the spaces she had been dragged into by love. She had not chosen to become a symbol, but the internet had chosen her. Inside the ballroom, she did not yet know the scale of it, but she felt it in the way her phone vibrated endlessly, in her clutch, in the quick darting glances of younger guests, whose devices glowed beneath the tables. The news had escaped the room. It was only a matter of time before it came roaring back in. Richard, oblivious, tried to carry on. He clinked glasses with donors, forcing charm into his voice. "Let's not dwell on unpleasantness," he told them. But his words fell flat, their eyes already shifting, their phones buzzing in their pockets. The silence of his inaction had not protected him. Eleanor excused herself, retreating to a quiet corridor. There, away from the chandeliers, she pulled out her phone. The notifications were relentless. Mentions, messages, tags from strangers she had never met. Her face filled her own screen in loop after loop. The slap, the stillness, the hesitation. She had thought the humiliation would stay contained within the ballroom. Instead, it had multiplied, magnified, weaponized. Her hands trembled as she scrolled. Some posts lifted her, calling her strength a lesson, her silence an act of quiet defiance. But others sliced her apart. One tweet read, "She should be grateful she even got invited. Now she's crying victim?" Typical. Another, "Richard's empire will crumble if he lets her drag him into these messes." Eleanor swallowed hard. The internet was a mirror, reflecting not just the slap but the ugliness lurking beneath society's skin. She thought of her mother back in Atlanta, scrolling on an old tablet, seeing her daughter's humiliation before Eleanor had even found the words to call her. Her words carried a cruel confidence, but Eleanor knew Victoria had underestimated something. The world did not forget this quickly. Not when video immortalized the moment. Not when the hashtags carried it across continents. Back in the ballroom, phones were being held a little higher. Guests scrolled, whispered, eyes darting to Eleanor, to Victoria, to Richard. The narrative was slipping beyond anyone's control. By midnight, major accounts had reposted the video. Activists latched onto it as proof of systemic humiliation faced by black women in elite spaces. Celebrities weighed in with solidarity. But just as quickly, the backlash deepened. Anonymous blogs dug into Eleanor's past, unearthing old photos from her childhood, mocking her background, her accent, her family. "She's not refined," one article sneered. "She's an imposter draped in designer gown." The cruelty was relentless. Eleanor sat alone in the corridor, scrolling through strangers dismantling her existence, as though it were a debate topic. She felt stripped, naked beneath the world's gaze. Richard finally found her there, his face pale. He held out his hand. "Eleanor, let's go home. We'll handle this tomorrow." She looked at him, searching for remorse, for fire, for anything that resembled protection. But his voice was flat, his eyes darting not to her pain but to his buzzing phone. She realized he wasn't worried about her. He was worried about headlines. "You handle it?" Eleanor whispered, her voice cracked, not with volume, but with the depth of disappointment. "You didn't even handle it in the room." Richard flinched, but he said nothing. Silence again. His familiar refuge. Meanwhile, the storm outside grew teeth. By dawn, the video had crossed platforms, appearing on morning talk shows, online magazines, and even international broadcasts. Anchors dissected it with feigned neutrality, their panels divided between outrage and dismissal. Some spoke of race, of power, of dignity denied. Others spoke of decorum, of misinterpretations, of how such matters should remain private. Eleanor was no longer just a woman. She was a headline. At a small newsroom downtown, a young journalist named Maya Linton watched the clip on loop. She saw more than a slap. She saw patterns, the kind she had chased for years in her reporting on race and privilege. Victoria Hayes wasn't just another socialite with a cruel streak. There was history here, and Maya had receipts. She pulled a file from her drawer, one she had started years ago, when whispers about Victoria first reached her desk. Former employees, dismissed nannies, staff from charity events, all with stories of exclusion, mockery, coded cruelty. Nothing had ever stuck, because Victoria's power shielded her. But now, with this video, the world was listening. Maya leaned over her keyboard, her fingers flying. She began drafting a story that would cut through the polished surface of Victoria Hayes. The slap was not the first offense. It was merely the most visible. And this time, there was proof. A journalist uncovers that this wasn't Victoria's first offense, and she is ready to expose everything. The video had shattered the veneer of perfection at the Hayes Gala, but Maya Linton knew it was only the beginning. The slap had gone viral, yes, but one act alone, even caught on camera, could be spun into misunderstanding, a moment taken out of context. What Maya needed was context. She needed history, patterns, proof that Victoria Hayes was not a woman who lost her temper once at a gala, but someone who had wielded privilege as a weapon for years. Maya was relentless. She combed through old notes, emails, scraps of testimony she had once set aside when her editor told her a Hayes expose was too risky. Now the story had teeth. Now the public was hungry. Her phone calls began early the next morning. A former nanny answered first, her voice shaky but eager. She used to tell me to make sure her children never played in the park if too many black families were around. She didn't say it outright, not at first. She'd say things like, the wrong crowd. But I knew what she meant. Everyone knew. Another voice came from a charity volunteer. Victoria would approve guest lists herself. I remember one year, a brilliant black pianist was scheduled to perform. She had him replaced at the last minute, saying his style didn't fit the tone of the evening. I heard her mutter, our donors prefer a certain look. Maya typed furiously, each quote another crack in Victoria's polished mask. One testimony turned into 5, then 10. A former caterer remembered her saying she didn't want too much color among the servers. A junior staffer recalled her joking that Eleanor looked like she wandered in from the wrong party at a luncheon years ago, long before the slap. Individually, the stories were whispers. Together they were a roar. By midday, Maya's article went live. Behind the slap, a pattern of exclusion in Victoria Hayes's circle. It detailed not just the gala, but a trail of testimonies spanning years, painting a portrait of a woman who had perfected the art of exclusion, while smiling for cameras. The response was immediate and ferocious. Supporters of Eleanor felt vindicated. We knew it wasn't just one moment. One tweet declared, this is who she's always been. But Victoria was not defenseless. Her media machine roared to life within hours. A glossy statement appeared on her foundation's website. I deeply regret any misunderstanding that occurred at the gala. My intention has always been to foster inclusivity and grace. Any suggestions otherwise are misrepresentations of isolated incidents, taken out of context. On morning television, a host sympathetic to the Hayes family read the statement aloud, nodding gravely. We must remember, people, that we live in a time of cancel culture. One video does not erase decades of charity work. Perhaps this is an example of the internet rushing to judgment. Eleanor watched from her penthouse, her phone in her lap, the television screen painting Victoria as the misunderstood victim. She wanted to throw the remote across the room. Misunderstood. The sting on her cheek told her otherwise. The cold, practiced cruelty in Victoria's eyes told her otherwise. But the media was slippery. Talk shows debated her tone. Pundits dissected Eleanor instead, questioning her silence. Why didn't she say something right away? One asked. If it was really that cruel, wouldn't she have reacted? The implication was clear. Her composure was being recast as complicity. Richard stood by the window, scrolling through market reports, as though nothing else existed. When Eleanor finally asked, did you see what they're saying about me? He replied without looking up. They'll spin it however they want. Best to stay quiet until it blows over. Quiet. Always quiet. Eleanor's chest burned. The world was tearing her apart, and her husband still saw silence as strategy. She realized then that Richard wasn't just unwilling to fight. He didn't believe her struggle was worth the fight. Meanwhile, Victoria doubled down. A glossy magazine published a cover featuring her smiling with children at one of her charity galas. The headline read, Philanthropy Under Fire, the woman behind the foundation. The article framed her as a victim of online mobs, a socialite unfairly targeted for one misinterpreted act. Eleanor scrolled through the comments on the piece, her stomach twisting. Leave her alone. She's done more for society than Eleanor ever will. Another, Eleanor's just using the race card. She's lucky to be where she is. The cruelty was relentless, each line a reminder that even with evidence, even with witnesses, truth could still be drowned out by power. But just as despair threatened to smother her, the unexpected arrived. A package was delivered to her building late in the evening. No return address, no sender. Inside was a single envelope, heavy and unmarked. Eleanor opened it slowly, her hands trembling. The letter inside was typed, precise, deliberate. You don't know me, but I know her. If you want proof that this isn't the first time Victoria Hayes has crossed the line, look deeper into her father's foundation records. There are payments there. Hush money, disguised as donations. People were silenced. I couldn't be one of them. Don't let her win again. Eleanor's breath caught. Her eyes scanned the page again and again, her pulse racing. This wasn't just rumor or testimony. This was a lead, a trail, a crack in the empire Victoria had built. And if the letter was true, Victoria's slap wasn't the story. It was the tip of something much darker. Eleanor receives an anonymous letter that changes everything, hinting at hush money buried in Victoria's family foundation. The letter trembled in Eleanor's hands long after she had finished reading it. The words seemed to burn themselves into her skin. Hush money, disguised as donations. Silence. She sat in the quiet of the penthouse, the city glittering beneath her like an endless constellation. But all she could see were shadows, the kind that grew when secrets festered. She read it again, slowly this time, searching for clues between the lines. Whoever had written it knew details only an insider could. The Hayes Foundation. Payments hidden as charitable contributions. People paid to disappear. But why send it to her? Her chest tightened. For the first time, the slap felt like more than humiliation. It felt like an opening, a tear in the fabric of power, revealing how much more was buried beneath. The next morning, while Richard buried himself in market reports and phone calls, Eleanor slipped into his office. His desk was immaculate, but she had lived with him long enough to know where he kept things hidden. The bottom drawer, locked but not impenetrable. She had once teased him about how predictable he was. She slid it open now with shaking hands. Inside were neatly arranged files. At first glance, they looked harmless. Quarterly earnings, contracts, charity records. But tucked in the back was a folder marked only with a date. 7 years ago, long before she had become his wife. She opened it. What stared back at her made her breath falter. A complaint letter, typed informal, from an employee at Whitmore Capital. The language was sharp, but careful. Allegations of discrimination, of being passed over for promotions, of being humiliated in meetings with racially coded remarks. Attached was a resignation letter, followed by a non-disclosure agreement. And behind it all, a signed check, 6 figures masked as a consulting payout. Eleanor's stomach turned. She flipped through more papers. Each one told the same story. A whisper of racism in the company. An employee who spoke up. A payout disguised as something else. She counted at least 4, different years, different names, but the same pattern. Her hands trembled as the realization formed. Richard had known. He hadn't just stayed silent at the gala out of fear or shock. He had practice. Silence was not hesitation. It was his strategy. When Richard finally entered the office, she was still sitting there, the folder open in her lap. His eyes widened slightly when he saw what she was holding, but his expression quickly hardened.
Where did you get that?
His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. Eleanor, it's complicated. You don't understand the world I operate in. These were isolated incidents. Settlements are standard practice in corporate law. Don't. Her voice cracked like glass. Don't reduce this to paperwork. These are people humiliated, diminished, erased, and you signed the checks to make them disappear. Eleanor's eyes glistened, not with tears but with fury. So when Victoria slapped me, humiliated me in front of everyone, you didn't freeze because you didn't know what to do. You froze because this is what you always do. You stay quiet. You protect yourself. You let the world devour people like me. And then you move on as if nothing happened. Richard's silence was its own confession. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. You think silence protects you, Eleanor whispered. But all it does is betray the people who need you most. It betrays me. He took a step closer, lowering his voice as though secrecy could soften the truth. You need to understand, Eleanor. The world doesn't change because of outrage. It changes because of leverage. And I can't afford to throw mine away on me, she cut in, her voice sharp, trembling. The words hung between them, like a blade. Richard's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His silence said more than any justification ever could. Eleanor's chest heaved. She had married him believing his silence was restraint, that it was a kind of discipline born of strategy. But now she saw it clearly. It was cowardice. It was betrayal, and it was a pattern he had never intended to break. The anonymous letter still lay on the desk, its words blazing in her mind. Don't let her win again. Eleanor realized that maybe it wasn't just Victoria who had been winning all these years. Richard had been handing her the victories by choosing silence, by allowing the system to protect itself at the expense of truth. She looked at her husband, then really looked at him, and saw not the powerful billionaire the world admired, but the smallness behind the empire. The man who had built his fortune, not just on deals and strategies, but on silence stacked like bricks. "You betrayed them," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "And you betrayed me." For the first time, Richard's composure cracked. His voice rose, defensive. "I gave you everything. This life, this security. Do you think any of it would exist if I stopped to fight every battle?" Eleanor's reply was a whisper, but it cut sharper than any shout. "I never asked you for everything. I only asked you not to abandon me." The words silenced him. He turned away, his hands clenched at his sides, his shoulders rigid. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city hummed outside their windows, uncaring, unstoppable. Eleanor felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had thought the fight was between her and Victoria, but now she saw it was larger. The rot wasn't just in a socialite's cruelty, it was in the silence that protected her, the silence that lived in her own home. And if she was going to stand against it, she would have to stand alone. Eleanor confronted Richard privately, and his response left her shattered. His silence wasn't hesitation. It was habit, a betrayal built into the foundation of their life together. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. The city stretched beyond the penthouse windows, restless and alive, yet she felt utterly alone in its glow. Richard had retreated to the guest room without a word after their confrontation, the silence between them thicker than the walls. She sat in the darkened living room, the anonymous letter and the damning company files spread across the coffee table like evidence at a trial. She traced the lines of the documents with trembling fingers. The hush money, the settlements, the signatures. Richard's betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a pattern, a philosophy of survival disguised as strategy. His silence at the gala had been nothing new. It was his creed. For the first time since the slap, Eleanor wondered if leaving him was the only way to salvage what remained of her dignity. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Leaving would mean freedom from the cage of his silence, but it would also mean surrendering everything she had endured. The position she now occupied, the platform that the viral video had forced upon her. If she walked away now, the story would end with her as a footnote. The humiliated wife, the woman who couldn't take the pressure. Victoria would spin it as proof she didn't belong, and Richard's empire would roll on untouched. But if she stayed, she risked being crushed under the weight of silence, forced to live as a symbol without a voice. The dilemma pressed on her chest like a stone. Her phone buzzed relentlessly beside her, notifications stacked on notifications. She opened one at random, a direct message from a young woman in Chicago. "I saw your video. I've been there too. Not at a gala, but in my office. My boss mocked me in front of everyone, and no one said a word. I stayed quiet. Seeing you endure it with dignity makes me feel less alone." Another message followed. "They'll try to silence you, but don't let them. You're speaking for all of us, even without saying a word." Eleanor pressed the phone to her chest, eyes stinging. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She hadn't asked to carry the weight of strangers' hope. Yet here they were, sending her their pain, their stories, their pleas for her to stand where they could not. The thought of walking away now felt like abandoning not just herself but them. By morning the story had evolved again. News outlets debated her silence with sharper tones. Some praised her composure as strength and stillness. Others condemned it as weakness, saying she should have spoken immediately if she wanted to be taken seriously. Why didn't she fight back? One pundit asked on live television. If she really felt humiliated, why not call it out on the spot? This looks like attention-seeking after the fact. The words cut like knives. Even her pain, caught on camera, wasn't enough. They demanded more, an outburst, a breakdown, something that would fit their script of how a black woman should respond to cruelty. Richard entered the living room mid-broadcast, his tie already knotted, his face unreadable. He paused only briefly at the sight of the files still scattered on the table. "You need to turn that off," he said flatly. "Stop feeding into it." Eleanor stared at him, incredulous. "Stop feeding into it, Richard. The world is dissecting my dignity. Our marriage, your silence, and you think ignoring it will make it go away." He exhaled, adjusting his cufflinks. "What do you want me to do? Get on camera and confess every misstep I've ever made? Destroy everything I've built? Because you don't like how I handled one situation?" "One situation?" Eleanor's voice rose, trembling with fury. "This isn't one situation. This is every time you've chosen comfort over justice. Every time you've let people like Victoria win because silence was easier. You betrayed me, Richard, and you betrayed every person who ever looked to you for leadership. His eyes darkened, but his words were calm, deliberate. You think you can change this world by shouting at it? You'll get eaten alive. I've kept us safe because I know how this game works. Eleanor shook her head. Safe? You call this safe? I'm drowning in the middle of your empire. I'm not safe, Richard. I'm suffocating. The silence that followed was unbearable. He turned, picked up his briefcase, and left without another word. Eleanor sank onto the sofa, her body trembling. She had never felt so alone. That afternoon her phone buzzed again, not with messages of support this time, but with a news alert. Her breath caught as she read the headline. Victoria Hayes to host press conference, setting the record straight. The article explained that Victoria had scheduled a media event for the following day, promising to clarify misconceptions about the gala and reiterate her lifelong commitment to inclusivity. Eleanor could practically hear Victoria's voice in the words, velvet, polished, poisonous. Panic rippled through her chest. A press conference wasn't just spin, it was war. Victoria would rewrite the narrative in real time, backed by the media machine she had cultivated for years. Eleanor knew exactly what she'd do: twist the slap into a misunderstanding, frame Eleanor as fragile or manipulative, and paint herself as the misunderstood philanthropist. If Victoria controlled the stage tomorrow, Eleanor would be erased. The thought left her breathless. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of being humiliated. She was afraid of being forgotten, her dignity swallowed in Victoria's performance. And then, as if fate had been listening, her phone buzzed once more. It was a message from Maya Linton, the journalist who had exposed Victoria's pattern. They'll use that press conference to bury you. But you don't have to stay silent anymore. If you're ready, I want to hear your side. The real side. Eleanor stared at the screen, her pulse pounding. Silence or resistance. Her decision had finally arrived. Victoria announces a press conference to set the record straight, forcing Eleanor to decide whether to stay silent or claim her voice before it's too late. The following afternoon, cameras crowded outside the Hayes Foundation headquarters, a marble fortress in the heart of Manhattan. Reporters pressed against barricades, their voices rising like a tide, microphones outstretched in hopes of catching a quote before the show began. The slap video had dominated headlines for days, and now the woman at its center, Victoria Hayes, was promising to set the record straight. Eleanor sat in her penthouse, the television flickering with live coverage, her palms pressed against her knees to steady the tremor in her hands. Every channel carried the same feed: Victoria stepping gracefully from a black car, photographers' flashes igniting around her like a storm of fireflies. She waved as if she were arriving at an awards ceremony, not a reckoning. Inside the foundation's grand hall, a stage had been set with banners of philanthropy, images of children smiling, scholarships awarded, lives supposedly changed by the Hayes fortune. It was a backdrop designed to remind everyone of her good works. Before she spoke a word, Victoria appeared before the podium in a tailored cream suit, flawless as ever. She smiled faintly at the rows of cameras, then began, her voice warm, deliberate, dripping with practiced sincerity. Thank you for being here today. I know the past week has been difficult for many of us. A private moment, taken wildly out of context, has been turned into a spectacle that distracts from the real mission of this foundation: service, compassion, and unity. Her tone was calm, maternal almost, as though she were scolding the world for misunderstanding her. I want to be absolutely clear, she continued, her hand resting lightly on the podium. I have always been committed to inclusivity. My record speaks for itself. I've hosted hundreds of events over the years, raising millions for causes that uplift communities of every background. I would never intentionally harm or demean anyone. What happened at the gala was a regrettable misunderstanding, magnified by the cruelty of the internet. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras zoomed closer. Eleanor could almost feel the narrative shifting in real time. Victoria's expression softened as she pressed her hand to her chest. Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor is someone I have always welcomed, despite her difficulties adjusting to the pressures of high society. That night, emotions ran high. Words were exchanged. I attempted to guide her back to composure. What the video shows, unfortunately, is an incomplete story. Eleanor's stomach clenched. She had expected spin, but hearing Victoria recast her as a fragile, unstable woman was a new cruelty. Victoria leaned slightly forward, her voice tightening just enough to sound burdened by restraint. I will not dwell on Eleanor's behavior, though it was at times inappropriate. She is under immense pressure, and I sympathize, but I will not stand by while my reputation and the good work of this foundation are destroyed by distortion. The words landed like daggers. Eleanor sat frozen, her breath shallow. She could see the room of reporters tilting toward Victoria's version, her poise too convincing, her lies too carefully polished. Then came the venom cloaked in velvet. She is, after all, new to this world. It is not easy to adapt. And sometimes, when one feels out of place, one imagines slights where none exist. I am deeply sorry if Eleanor felt hurt. That was never my intention. But I cannot be held responsible for perceptions that are not grounded in truth. The implication was clear. Eleanor was paranoid, ungrateful, manipulative. A murmur spread through the room. Some reporters nodded, their pens scratching as if the story were already written. Philanthropists smeared by misunderstanding. Fragile wife misread situation. Eleanor gripped the edge of the sofa, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream at the television, to stand in that room, and tell the truth. But she wasn't there. Victoria had the stage, and Eleanor was invisible again. Until the twist arrived. A hand shot up in the crowd. Maya Linton. Eleanor recognized her instantly, the young journalist who had published the damning testimonies days before. Victoria's eyes flickered with irritation, but she gestured politely. Yes, Miss Linton. Maya stood, her voice clear, unwavering. Victoria, you say this was a misunderstanding, but the video doesn't look like a guiding gesture. It looks like a slap. Victoria's smile tightened. The internet loves to exaggerate. I was calming her. Nothing more. Ask anyone who was there. Maya didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet. With respect, the internet isn't the only one watching. We have the unedited footage. The room stilled. Cameras swung toward her. Reporters leaning forward. Breath held. Victoria's mask slipped for the briefest second, eyes widening before snapping back into control. Footage can be manipulated, she said quickly. Surely you understand. But Maya wasn't listening. She held the tablet high, connecting it to the press hall's screen via a cable she had arranged with another reporter. A moment later, the giant display behind Victoria flickered, and the gala replayed in high definition. The slap, unmistakable. The silence that followed. Eleanor's stillness, not weakness but quiet dignity, and Richard hesitating, failing.
Victoria turned, watching herself on the screen. For the first time, her composure cracked.
Eleanor leaned forward on the sofa, her pulse racing. For days she had been silenced, rewritten, diminished. But here, in this press hall, her truth was finally louder than Victoria's venom. The camera stayed on the screen, replaying the moment in painful clarity. Victoria's voice was drowned by the sound of the slap echoing through the hall, over and over. Gasps filled the room as Eleanor's silent dignity stood in stark contrast to Victoria's venom, and the world watched the truth unravel in real time. The press hall was still buzzing with shock when the footage ended. The sound of Victoria's hand striking Eleanor reverberated, like an unwanted bell, ringing through every corner of the room. Reporters clutched their notebooks tighter, whispers rippled, and camera shutters fired in rapid succession. Victoria tried to reclaim her composure, smoothing her suit jacket and forcing her smile back into place, but the moment had shifted. She was no longer in control of the story. Across the city, televisions replayed the footage on loop. On social media, hashtags surged again, this time with sharper edges. Believe Eleanor, unedited truth, silent dignity. In her penthouse, Eleanor sat before the screen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For the first time since the gala, the world had seen not just her humiliation, but her strength, the stillness she had held, not out of fragility, but out of defiance. Yet even with vindication rippling across the country, she knew silence would not be enough anymore. She remembered the hundreds of messages that had poured into her phone, women confessing their own humiliations, workers describing how they'd been diminished in offices and classrooms, strangers telling her she was carrying their weight. They weren't asking her to be perfect, they were asking her to speak. And Eleanor realized she could no longer afford not to. The following morning, Maya Linton called. Her voice was steady but urgent. The world is listening now, Eleanor. Victoria's lies are crumbling. But if you don't speak for yourself, they'll still find a way to twist it. You don't have to rage. You don't have to shout. Just tell your truth. That's enough. Eleanor hesitated, staring out the window at the city below. She had never wanted to be a symbol. But the slap, the silence, the betrayal, it had forced her into a role she could no longer walk away from. If her dignity had been stolen in public, then she would reclaim it in public too. Later that afternoon, she walked into a studio arranged by Maya. Cameras lined the small stage, journalists filled the seats, and the air hummed with expectation. Eleanor wore no jewels, no extravagant gown, just a simple black dress that mirrored the solemnity of the moment. When she stepped to the podium, a hush fell across the room. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her fingers resting lightly on the wood, her gaze scanning the crowd. She could feel the weight of millions watching from their screens, waiting to hear her speak for the first time. When she finally did, her voice was calm, steady, piercing. I did not choose to become a headline. I did not ask to have my dignity debated in living rooms and newsrooms across the country. But since the world has seen me at my most humiliated, I want the world to hear me now. The room leaned closer. Pens paused midair. At the gala, I was slapped in front of hundreds of people. But the slap itself is not the only story. What followed was silence. Silence from the room. Silence from people who knew better. Silence from my own husband. Her throat tightened, but she pressed forward, her voice unwavering. And that silence is something every black woman knows too well. Because when you are humiliated in plain sight, the cruelty is not just in the hand that strikes you, it is in the eyes that look away. A murmur swept the room, the gravity of her words cutting deeper than any dramatic outburst could. I have lived in these circles for years now. Circles of wealth, circles of privilege. I have worn the gowns, smiled through the dinners, shaken the hands, and yet no matter what I wore or how politely I spoke, I was always reminded that I was seen as different, not as Eleanor, not as a woman, but as an intruder who would never truly belong. She paused, her eyes glistening, her breath steady. I know what people have said, that I imagined it, that I exaggerated, that I should have fought back with more fire. But hear me. Silence is not weakness. Dignity is not fragility. My stillness that night was not surrender. It was survival. Because when you are a black woman in a room that wants you invisible, sometimes the loudest protest you can make is to simply stand tall and refuse to disappear. The words landed like thunder. Some journalists scribbled furiously. Others simply watched, stunned. Eleanor pressed on, her voice tightening with quiet intensity. This is not only my story. It is the story of every woman who has been dismissed in boardrooms, mocked in classrooms, passed over in offices, excluded at parties. It is the story of people told they should be grateful to even be present, while being reminded every day that they do not belong. The room was silent, the weight of her truth pressing against every chest. For too long, people like Victoria Hayes have been allowed to hide cruelty behind charm. For too long, men like Richard Whitmore have chosen silence over justice. But I will not be silent anymore. If my pain has to be public, then so will my truth. When she finished, the room erupted, not with chaos, but with applause. It began hesitantly, then built into a wave, some journalists standing, clapping not for spectacle, but for a moment they knew would be remembered. Across the country, viewers sat in stunned silence. Some wept. Others shared the clip instantly, hashtags multiplying, and Eleanor's voice, silent no more. Her words pierced into homes and hearts, resonating with anyone who had ever swallowed their pain to survive. But the moment did not end there. As the applause faded, a reporter near the front raised her hand. Her question sliced through the air like a blade. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said clearly, "you've spoken powerfully about silence. But your husband, Richard Whitmore, stood silent at the gala. He stood silent as this story unfolded. Do you believe he stands with you now?" Gasps echoed. Cameras zoomed in, and suddenly the story shifted again. Eleanor's chest tightened, her lips parting but no words coming. She hadn't expected the question so soon. Not in this moment. "Richard Whitmore is in this building today. Will he stand with his wife here and now?" The room turned. All eyes searched the back, where Richard had indeed entered quietly moments earlier, standing near the door with his arms folded. His expression tense. Cameras swung toward him. The silence grew unbearable. Richard was forced into the spotlight, a reporter's voice echoing the question the entire world now demanded. "Do you stand with your wife?" The reporter's question, Do you stand with your wife? Still reverberated long after the press hall emptied. Richard had not answered. He had stood frozen, eyes shifting between Eleanor at the podium and the reporter's hungry stares, before quietly slipping out a side door. That silence, replayed on every channel, became its own headline. A marriage divided in public view. The next morning, the fallout spread like cracks through glass. Investors called Richard's office relentlessly. Some couched their words in measured concern. Richard, markets don't like uncertainty. Others were blunt. Your wife's speech has the board questioning whether you can control this narrative. Where do you stand? Emails piled up. Subject lines screaming urgency. Portfolio risk. Foundation backlash. PR meltdown. Richard locked himself in his study, staring at the screens that once gave him confidence, but now mocked him with red arrows. Stocks connected to his firm began to dip, not because of fundamentals, but because of perception. Investors were pulling out, afraid of being entangled in controversy. His empire, built on appearances of strength and stability, was bleeding from the wound of his silence. At a board meeting held via video call, faces of men and women who had once deferred to him now looked stern, even hostile. We need clarity, Richard, one board member said. This is no longer about Eleanor or Victoria. This is about confidence. Investors don't want a leader who can't manage his own household, let alone a multi-billion-dollar firm. The words cut deep. Richard clenched his jaw but gave no reply. Richard ended the call without answering. He poured himself a drink, a glass shaking faintly in his hand. For years, silence had been his weapon, his strategy, his shield. Now it was the very thing destroying him. He could feel the empire he had built fracturing beneath his feet, not because of a market collapse or bad investment, but because he refused to say aloud what the world demanded, that his wife's dignity mattered more than his reputation. But did he believe that? His hesitation at the gala replayed in his mind, not as a single moment of weakness, but as a reflection of who he had become. He had chosen power so many times that he no longer recognized the man who once courted Eleanor in a library, eager to hear her mind. That man was gone. In his place stood someone who measured every truth against a balance sheet. Across the city, Eleanor's speech continued to trend. Clips of her calm, piercing words played on talk shows, shared across social platforms, quoted in headlines. When you are humiliated in plain sight, the cruelty is not just in the hand that strikes you, it is in the eyes that look away. The line pierced America's conscience. It also pierced Richard's empire like a blade. By evening, financial news networks were reporting a confidence crisis at Whitmore Capital. Commentators debated openly whether Richard could survive as CEO. Analysts noted how quickly fortunes could collapse when public trust faltered. And through it all, Richard said nothing. Eleanor, watching from the other side of the penthouse, felt no triumph in his unraveling. She saw only the cost of silence, hers and his. They lived in the same home, but moved like strangers, passing each other without words, their worlds diverging even as they shared the same space. It was late one night, while Richard sat in his study with the curtains drawn, that Victoria appeared. She entered without hesitation, her heels clicking against the marble, her silver presence as sharp as ever. You're unraveling, Richard, she said plainly, settling into the chair opposite him. The board is restless. Investors are skittish. And all because you can't decide which side you're on. Richard glared at her. You have no idea the pressure I'm under. Victoria smiled faintly. On the contrary, I know exactly, because I've been the one managing perception while you stood frozen. But I can help you, if you'll let me. He laughed bitterly. Help? You're the reason this happened. Am I? She countered smoothly. Or is the reason that your wife has turned herself into a martyr, and you've let her do it unchecked? Richard's knuckles whitened around his glass. Careful, Victoria. She leaned forward, her eyes glinting. I'm offering you a way out. The press loves her now, but the tide will turn. It always does. All you have to do is distance yourself before her story consumes you. Make a clean break. Publicly. Permanently. His chest tightened. What are you saying? Victoria's voice dropped to a near whisper. Venom sweetened with promise. Divorce her. Announce that you cannot align with her crusade. Investors will breathe easier. The board will forgive you, and I will make sure the Hayes Foundation publicly supports Whitmore Capital again. You'll survive this. But only if you cut her loose. The words hung in the air like poison. For the first time, Richard felt the full weight of the choice before him, not just between Eleanor and his empire, but between the man he once was and the hollow man he had become. Victoria sat back, crossing her legs, her smile faint but victorious. Think carefully, Richard. Silence has cost you enough. Don't let loyalty finish the job. Victoria offered Richard a way out. If he divorced Eleanor. The moment Victoria left his study, Richard collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. Her words, divorce her, cut her loose, echoed in the silence like a curse. For years he had believed himself untouchable, a man who controlled outcomes with calculated precision. Yet here he was, cornered by investors, betrayed by his own silence, and now given a choice that threatened to split his life in two. His empire or his wife. He poured another drink, the amber liquid trembling as it filled the glass. He told himself he loved Eleanor. He told himself he had always loved her, but love was not the currency that had built Whitmore Capital. Silence was. And silence demanded sacrifices. He wondered if Eleanor was to become one of them. The next morning, the world felt colder. Financial networks reported another dip in his company's stock. Investors were demanding a statement. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting. His phone buzzed with reminders of obligations he no longer had, the clarity to face. But it was Eleanor's absence from the breakfast table that unsettled him most. She sat instead by the window of their penthouse, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the city below. The morning light caught her face, illuminating the quiet strength she had carried through humiliation and betrayal. She didn't look broken. She looked resolved. When he approached, she didn't turn to him. Eleanor, he began carefully, things are difficult right now. We need to think strategically. She let out a short, hollow laugh. Strategically. That's always your answer. I'm trying to protect what we've built. What you've built, she corrected, finally turning to face him. Because let's be honest, Richard, you didn't marry me because I fit into this world. You married me because I didn't. And somewhere along the way, you decided that was a liability instead of a strength. Do you know what people are sending me, Richard? Stories. Letters. Thousands of them. Women who have been humiliated, silenced, erased. People who saw themselves in me when Victoria's hand struck my face. Do you know what I realized reading them? He shook his head, speechless. That whether you choose me or not doesn't matter anymore. I don't need your empire to validate me. I don't need your silence to protect me. I have a voice, and it's stronger than anything you've ever given me. He tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled it back gently, her expression steady. I loved you, Richard. I probably still do. But love without respect, without courage, it's just another form of silence, and I won't live in silence anymore. The room felt suffocating. Richard turned away, pacing, his mind torn between the weight of the board's demands and the woman standing resolute before him. He thought of Victoria's proposition, of the empire he had spent decades building. Divorce Eleanor and survive. For the first time in his life, the numbers didn't add up. Later that day, at Whitmore Capital's board meeting, the pressure mounted. Investors need certainty. One director snapped. We cannot afford to let this scandal drag on. Another added coldly, your wife has made herself into an activist. That doesn't align with our interests. You must choose, Richard. He stared at their faces on the screen, a gallery of wealth and power, all waiting for him to sacrifice Eleanor for their comfort. He felt a wave of nausea, but he also felt something else. Shame. Shame that he had let them dictate his silence for so long. Shame that he had let Eleanor face cruelty alone. Shame that he was even considering letting her go. I need time, he said finally, his voice low. Time is money, one of them shot back. And you're running out of both. The call ended in cold silence, the board's impatience heavy in the air. Richard sat alone in his office, knowing he was a man unraveling. Meanwhile, Eleanor's path was becoming clearer. She had spent the afternoon reading messages from strangers who had turned her into more than a victim. They called her a symbol, a survivor, a voice they wished they'd had in their own humiliations. That evening, she met Maya Linton in a quiet cafe downtown, away from the flashing cameras. Maya leaned across the table, eyes alight with urgency. Eleanor, the world isn't just watching you anymore. They're waiting for you. Victoria tried to bury you, but your silence that night, your dignity, it struck something deeper. You can't let this moment slip away. Use it. Eleanor stirred her tea slowly, her reflection rippling in the dark liquid. I'm not an activist. I didn't ask for this. The words lingered, Eleanor thought of her mother working endless shifts, of the girl she had once been in Atlanta, dreaming of stability. She thought of the letter she had received, the hush money buried in Richard's empire. She thought of the thousands of voices now looking to her for strength. When she finally looked up, her eyes were steady. "Then I won't run." Maya smiled, sensing the shift. That night, back at the penthouse, Richard found Eleanor packing a small suitcase. "Where are you going?" he asked, panic threading through his voice. She zipped the bag slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "To tell my story, on my own terms, without you." His face paled. "Eleanor, wait. If you walk out now." She cut him off, her voice calm but firm. "I've been waiting for you to stand with me, Richard. But I can't wait anymore. This fight isn't about your empire. It's about me. And I'm done being silent." He stepped forward, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Don't do this, Eleanor. You'll destroy everything." She shouldered the bag, her posture unyielding. "Maybe some things deserve to be destroyed." And with that she walked past him, leaving the penthouse without looking back. Eleanor made a shocking move, independent of Richard, stepping out on her own to tell her story, no longer tethered to his silence or his empire. Eleanor didn't look back as she left the penthouse. The city swallowed her whole, its night air sharp with winter and possibility. She had left behind Richard's silence, his empire, the marble walls that had both protected and imprisoned her. With her suitcase in hand, she walked into uncertainty, but for the first time it was her choice. The next morning, she stood in a modest community center in Harlem. It smelled of fresh paint and coffee, the walls plastered with flyers for local meetings, rallies, and mutual aid drives. Here the energy was different, not polished, not wealthy, but alive. Activists, young and old, welcomed her not as a spectacle but as a sister. Maya introduced her to them, each handshake firm, each embrace sincere. "This is Eleanor," she said simply. "You already know her story, but she's here to fight, not to be pitied." Eleanor felt the weight of their gazes. Not judgment, not suspicion, expectation. These were people who had been fighting for years, long before her slap had gone viral. They didn't see her as a savior. They saw her as someone who could amplify what they'd been shouting into the void. She cleared her throat, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers. I'm not an activist by training. I'm just a woman who's tired of being silenced." Applause broke out, not thunderous but affirming, like a promise. Within days, Eleanor's presence electrified the movement. She joined rallies, stood on courthouse steps, gave interviews not as a victim but as a voice. Her calm composure, the very thing Victoria had tried to weaponize against her, became her greatest strength. Dignity is not weakness. Silence is not complicity. It is survival, but it cannot be forever. Victoria, watching from the marble walls of her foundation, felt her influence slipping. Donors pulled out quietly, their names vanishing from gala invitations. Corporate partners who once boasted of association with her family now issued vague statements about reviewing commitments. The glossy magazine covers dried up, replaced by op-eds, dissecting her cruelty, her hypocrisy, her downfall. For the first time in her life, Victoria's name was no longer untouchable. Meanwhile, the same elite society that had once excluded Eleanor now shifted nervously. Invitations began arriving at her temporary Harlem apartment. Dinners, panels, televised interviews. Politicians wanted her endorsement. Celebrities wanted her presence. Corporations wanted her voice attached to their diversity campaigns. Eleanor read them carefully, then set most aside. She had no interest in being a token now that she had become valuable. She chose her stages deliberately. Community rallies, grassroots fundraisers, school auditoriums. She wanted her voice to echo where it mattered most, not just where it would look good on television. One evening, she spoke at a university auditorium packed to the rafters. Students held signs, chanting her name. She stood at the podium, her voice carrying through the room with quiet fire. "I was slapped, yes. But the real wound wasn't on my face. It was in the silence that followed. That silence exists everywhere. In classrooms, in boardrooms, in streets patrolled by police, who see some lives as less valuable than others. What happened to me is not an isolated story. It is the story of every person who has been told they do not belong, and every person who has been abandoned when they needed someone to stand with them. I will not let that silence win again." For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like she was carrying the weight alone. The movement wasn't hers to own. It was hers to amplify. And in that realization, she found freedom. Richard watched from afar, his empire unraveling while Eleanor's influence grew. Investors who once worshipped him now whispered doubts, while Eleanor's speeches filled headlines. He realized with bitter clarity that he had lost not only his wife but the respect of a world that saw in her what he had been too blind to defend. Meanwhile, Victoria's desperation grew. She tried everything: new press statements, glossy ads featuring her foundation's good works, even tearful interviews, where she painted herself as a victim of cancel culture. But none of it stuck. The unedited video replayed again and again, erasing every polished word. The ultimate reversal had taken hold. The woman Victoria tried to erase was now the woman the world was listening to. And Victoria herself had become the villain in the very story she once controlled. But Eleanor knew her work was not finished. Late one night, after returning from a rally, she found another envelope slipped beneath her apartment door. Inside was a single page. "You don't know how deep this goes. The Hayes family has silenced more than you can imagine. Look into the foundation's overseas accounts. There are more victims, more payments. They won't stop until they're exposed." Her pulse quickened. Another lead. Another door into the rot that Victoria had spent decades hiding. Eleanor realized her fight was no longer just personal. It was systemic. She froze, clutching the paper in her hand. Slowly, she opened the door. There, standing in the hallway, was Victoria Hayes. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup streaked, her eyes red from crying. She looked nothing like the polished socialite who had once struck her across the face. She looked broken. "Eleanor," Victoria whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, I need your help." Victoria, desperate and in tears, showed up at Eleanor's door. Eleanor stood frozen at the door. For weeks, Victoria Hayes had been a symbol of her humiliation. Untouchable, powerful, venom wrapped in charm. But the woman before her now looked nothing like the silver-clad socialite who had struck her at the gala. Her hair hung loose, her makeup smudged, her shoulders hunched as though she had shrunk beneath the weight of her own downfall. "Please," Victoria whispered again, her voice trembling. "Can I come in?" Every instinct in Eleanor screamed no. But something in Victoria's face, desperation raw and unfamiliar, made her step aside. Victoria entered slowly, as though afraid of being rejected, her eyes darting around the modest Harlem apartment, as if it were a foreign country. She had spent her life in penthouses and estates. This space, humble but alive, was worlds away from the marble halls she once commanded. Eleanor closed the door behind them, arms folded. "Why are you here?" Victoria sank into the nearest chair, clutching her hands together. For a long moment, she said nothing, her breathing shallow. Then, in a voice hoarse with exhaustion, she confessed, "They've all left me. The donors, the partners, the board, even the women who used to hang on my every word, won't return my calls. My name, it's poison now." Eleanor remained silent, watching her. Victoria swallowed hard. "I know I deserve it. I know what I did to you at the gala was unforgivable. But it wasn't just the slap, was it? It was everything before. The whispers, the digs, the way I made you feel like you didn't belong." She bowed her head. "I don't even know why I did it. Maybe because I was afraid. Afraid that you represented a world changing faster than I could control." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry. Truly. I can't undo what I've done. But I can't survive this without your forgiveness. I need you to tell the world I'm not the monster they think I am." Eleanor's chest tightened, but not with pity. With clarity. For years, Victoria had held the power. For years, Eleanor had been the one forced to endure, to explain, to swallow indignities. Now, the roles had reversed, and Victoria was the one begging for mercy. Eleanor sat across from her, her tone calm but sharp. "You want me to save you? After you humiliated me in front of hundreds. After you tried to erase me, twist my silence into weakness, and convince the world I didn't belong. And now, when the world finally sees you for who you are, you come to me?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I know how it sounds, but I don't have anyone else. You don't understand what it's like to be cast out of the circles you built your life around." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "Don't I? I've lived my whole life being cast out. The difference is, I didn't build my worth on those circles. You did." Victoria flinched as though the words had struck her. Eleanor leaned closer, her voice steady. Forgiveness isn't about saving you. Forgiveness is about freeing me. You don't need my forgiveness to move on. You need it to rebuild your reputation. But I don't owe you that. Victoria's tears spilled freely now, streaking down her face. Please, just say one word on my behalf. Just once. If you do, maybe I can start again. Maybe I can. Eleanor raised her hand, silencing her. Do you even hear yourself? You want me to validate you so you can slip back into the world that tried to erase me. Forgiveness doesn't work that way. You can't use it as a key to unlock your old life. Forgiveness is not a tool. It's a release. The room fell quiet, heavy with the truth of her words. Victoria lowered her gaze, her shoulders trembling. For the first time, Eleanor saw her not as an enemy, but as a mirror of what power built on cruelty could do. How quickly it collapsed when stripped of applause. And in that moment, Eleanor understood something. If she clung to her anger, if she let Victoria's cruelty define her, she would remain trapped in the same cage, just on the opposite side. Forgiveness wasn't for Victoria, it was for herself to free her from carrying the weight of hatred any longer. She inhaled deeply, her voice softening but not bending. I forgive you, Victoria. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. It does not mean I'll save your name. It means I will no longer let you haunt me. Victoria's head snapped up, eyes wide with shock. She had expected absolution, redemption. What she received instead was release. Eleanor letting go, but refusing to hand her back the keys to power. The silence stretched, broken only by Victoria's shallow breaths. For the first time, the woman who had once stood as a queen of New York society looked small, diminished not by scandal, but by her own desperation. Eleanor rose from her chair, moving toward the door. You should go. Victoria stood slowly, swaying as if the words had taken the last strength from her. She wiped her tears clumsily, nodding. I don't know what to do now. Eleanor opened the door, her voice firm. Maybe for once, sit with the consequences. That's something the rest of us have had to do all our lives. Victoria stepped into the hallway, her figure trembling beneath the dim light. For a brief moment, she turned back, her eyes pleading one last time. But Eleanor's gaze remained steady, unflinching. The door closed with a quiet click. But just as peace brushed against her, her phone buzzed with a message that made her blood run cold. It was from Maya. 3 words that promised everything was far from over. Check tomorrow's headlines. Eleanor delivered one final, unexpected decision, granting forgiveness for herself, not for Victoria, only to learn that something even bigger awaited her in the morning. Eleanor barely slept. Maya's message, check tomorrow's headlines, kept pulsing in her mind like a warning bell. She rose before dawn, the Harlem apartment still cloaked in shadows, and turned on the television. The headlines rolled across every channel. Hayes Foundation, under investigation for financial misconduct. Whistleblowers come forward, payments disguised as donations. Victoria Hayes' empire crumbles under mounting evidence. The anonymous letters had been true. Victoria's slap had been the spark, but now the fire had consumed everything she once controlled. For decades, her family had hidden payments, silenced voices, bought their way out of accountability. The receipts, long buried, were now public. Eleanor stared at the screen, a strange calm settling over her. She had once believed the slap was the worst humiliation of her life. Now she saw it differently. That single act, cruel and deliberate, had ripped a veil from an entire system of silence. What began as her shame had become a reckoning for something far larger than her. Later that day, Eleanor walked through the city, unrecognized in a plain coat and scarf. Yet even in anonymity, she could feel the ripple her name carried. Snippets of conversation floated from strangers. She's stronger than I could have been. Silent dignity. That's power. She turned humiliation into history. She paused at a cafe window, where a television replayed the slap, yet again, but this time paired with commentary that framed it not as a scandal, but as a catalyst. A voiceover narrated. This was not just a moment of cruelty. It was a mirror held up to America's soul. And Eleanor Whitmore, in her silence, in her calm, reminded us that dignity can speak louder than violence. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. The sting of that night had never left her cheek, but now it burned with a different meaning. Not as a wound, but as a mark of survival. That evening, she agreed to one final televised interview. her first and last reflection on the slap itself. The studio lights were harsh, the cameras unblinking, but Eleanor's voice was soft, steady, and unyielding. "The night of the gala," she began, "I was struck in front of a room full of people. But what hurt most wasn't the slap. It was the silence that followed. That silence told me that my dignity was negotiable, that my presence could be erased with one gesture. For a long time, I thought I would carry that humiliation forever. But the truth is, it became something else." She paused, her gaze fixed on the lens as though speaking directly into the living rooms of millions. "That slap was meant to reduce me. Instead, it revealed the truth. It showed the world that injustice, when exposed, cannot be silenced. My dignity wasn't in what I endured. It was in what I refused to surrender. Not wealth, not marriage, just dignity. And that became my greatest weapon." The interviewer leaned forward. "And what do you say to those who claim this was all about high society drama, that it doesn't reflect real struggles?" Eleanor's expression hardened, but her voice remained calm. "I say humiliation has no class boundaries. Whether it happens in a gala ballroom or a workplace break room, racism is the same. Disrespect is the same. Silence in the face of it is the same. My story is just one story, but it belongs to millions who never had the camera rolling." When the interview aired, it spread faster than any previous clip, not because of scandal, but because of its haunting simplicity. People replayed her calm expression, her steady voice, her refusal to let rage consume her. Her stillness had become a weapon, her truth a mirror. In schools, teachers played her speech to students, asking what silence meant to them. In workplaces, HR departments circulated her words in diversity training sessions. Activists quoted her at rallies. Lawmakers cited her during debates. Eleanor's humiliation had transformed into a symbol, and symbols could not be erased. Even Richard could not escape it. Alone in his penthouse, he watched his wife, no, his former wife in all but name, become larger than the empire he had built. He saw in her what he had failed to protect, what his silence had destroyed. For the first time, he realized that his billions had bought him nothing compared to the dignity she now carried freely. And Victoria? She vanished from the spotlight entirely. The once celebrated socialite was now a pariah, her foundation gutted, her name synonymous with disgrace. Yet Eleanor spared no energy for her. Forgiveness had freed her from carrying Victoria's weight. The rest was no longer her burden. Weeks later, Eleanor returned to Atlanta to visit her mother. The small apartment was warm, smelling of collard greens and old books. Her mother held her face gently, thumb brushing the cheek where the slap had once landed. "You turned it into something they'll never forget," her mother whispered. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I just refused to disappear." As she lay in her childhood bed that night, Eleanor thought of the girl she once was, dreaming of stability, of a life where she could finally rest. That girl could never have imagined that her dignity, tested in the harshest of ways, would ignite something larger than her dreams. The slap had been meant to break her. Instead, it had broken the silence. And yet, the story did not end with her alone. It ended with a question that lingered long after the screens went dark, long after the headlines faded, long after Eleanor herself stepped quietly back from the spotlight. Because the truth of her story was not just in what she endured, but in what it demanded of everyone who saw it. As the video replayed one last time, the question remained, whispered not from Eleanor's lips, but from the conscience of the nation itself. What would you have done if the whole world watched you being slapped? When silence protects the guilty and shames the innocent, we all become part of the problem. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Type yes if you believe in justice, and subscribe if you refuse to stay silent.